I went to Washington, D.C. to do a piece on corruption in our government. I emailed all 100 senators and only one agreed to meet with me. That man is Senator Ron Johnson from the great state of Wisconsin. He labels himself as a small government conservative. In this episode, we discuss all sorts of crazy subjects, including aliens, UFOs, Jeffrey Epstein, and more. And I won't be surprised if YouTube censors this or shadow bans it. So I had a great time speaking to Senator Johnson. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the episode. Ladies and gentlemen, today is a special treat. We emailed all 100 U.S. senators multiple times, and we were able to get a meeting with Senator Ron Johnson. First, I want to dispel a stereotype that I had in my mind before I met you. I figured if I'm meeting a U.S. senator, I figured that they're probably greedy, that they're just kind of a bad person. And I think that's the image a lot of Americans have of politics. But I was able to sit down. We met a few times off camera. And I like you. I agree with a lot of what you say. I think you're truthful. I think you're genuine. And I'm happy that you're representing us. So first of all, I guess just thank you for letting us be here and that we're doing this.
Well, first of all, let me say I think it's unfortunate that that would be your first impression of any U.S. senator. Listen, I strenuously disagree with a lot of my colleagues, okay? Mm-hmm. I don't think there are that many that are serving because they're greedy. That they're trying to make money off the gig. They have their ideas, and I think most people come here to serve because they want to improve this country in some way, shape, or form. So, I mean, I think that's basically true.
So before we came here, we interviewed people in the airport in different cities. We've interviewed people in all sorts of demographics, and the common response is, no, I don't trust the government. Why do you think that is?
Because the government's, untrustworthy. It has not been honest. It hasn't been transparent. Hasn't been honest and transparent for decades, quite honestly. So I also think the pandemic in particular opened an awful lot of people's eyes, exposed an awful lot of the corruption, the corporate capture of, for example, Big Pharma's capture of the health agencies, quite honestly, of the mainstream media. But it's not just Big Pharma and health agency. It's Big Ag capturing USDA. It's the military-industrial complex capturing so much. So, and it's not just from the private sector side either. You've got big unions also capturing these agencies. For example, how we shut down the schools, that was all driven by the teachers union. So people need to understand unions are businesses primarily. They're business. I mean, their business, their customers are the union members that are paying them dues. That's their revenue.
Okay, so there's a lot we can touch on there, but one thing you said that caught my attention was the military-industrial complex. Tell me more about what you mean when you say that.
Well, it's really as Eisenhower described it. And we were talking earlier about a book, JFK and the Unspeakable. I think it's interesting, Bobby Kennedy in his The Real Anthony Fauci book, documentary on his book, it starts out with Eisenhower's speech, where Eisenhower warned America to beware of the military-industrial complex. Now, Eisenhower warned Kennedy. He didn't do anything about it when he was president. He just pretty well dumped that in Kennedy's lap. And I think we've been experiencing the fallout ever since. But again, you're talking about the corporate interests, the weapons manufacturers. It's obviously in their benefit to go to war.
Because we've been involved in
how else can I say that? I mean, the war machine suits their interests. And I think we need to be careful of anybody who has a financial interest of pushing America into these foreign entanglements.
I just read a book about World War I, and it was told from multiple sides of the story, the Germans, the French, the British, the Americans, the Russians. And the theme across it all to me was all these young men sacrificing their life, starving to death, getting diseases in the trenches. Well,
for what?
For what?
For what?
And while the leaders of the country were dining lavishly and the lords and the earls of the British got to wear their fancy uniforms and not really go into danger. And when I see young men being used as kind of a profit arm of the government, it's very disheartening. What would be your take on that?
Well, take a look at the wars fought recently. And then was the situation made better because of the war? Now, take a look at the Gulf War. did that improve the Middle East? Did that keep Iran in check? Prior to blowing up Iraq was a check on the mullahs in Iran. So now we don't have a check on that. Now we're concerned about Iran becoming a nuclear power. Afghanistan. I'd like to think that the U.S. president had some benefit in terms of allowing little girls to go to school and the lessening the brutality of the Taliban. But here you are, 20-some years later, now the Taliban are back in control. Well, and women are losing their rights. Take a look at what's happening in Ukraine today. I don't know. I literally do not know. Even though I was here, U.S. Senator, I was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Europe. I've been to Ukraine multiple times. I thought Zelensky was a real deal. But I don't know to what extent the U.S. really fomented the revolution of dignity. Now, I know the Ukrainian people want freedom. They want what we have. They want to be, Western leading. They want to integrate with the Western economies, and they want to kind of leave the corruption of Russia behind. But, recognizing spheres of influence, the fact that Ukraine's right on Russia's border, should we have been poking the eye of the bear there? Should we have been helping foment a revolution that overthrew a government that, certainly was helpful to Putin? What's been the result? You have that revolution of dignity. Russia feels, whether you think it's justified or not, they feel threatened, so they invade Crimea to protect their naval base there. Then they invade eastern Ukraine. Then they eventually invade all of Ukraine. And now we're just watching the just bit-by-bit destruction of Ukraine. Did it work? So, again, we're not retrospective that way. We don't sit and go, okay, what did we do? What were involved in? And by the way, most of that involvement is secret. I don't know to what extent we fomented that. That was back there in the old, Burisma time frame under the Obama administration, Victoria Nuland and Vice President Biden going over there and being the, I don't know to what extent we helped foment.
When you say secretive, are you talking like our intelligence agencies might be involved in stoking things up?
Just even our State Department. To what extent are we ramping up the public displeasure and kind of help foment these revolutions? Now, again, I don't know, but all I'm saying is go back and take a look at what has been the result. Listen, I was supportive of the Ukrainian people. I thought the revolution of dignity was probably a good thing. They wanted to shed the legacy of corruption. That's what that was mainly about. They wanted a less corrupt society. They wanted to integrate with the West so they have greater freedom and greater prosperity. But that wasn't Vladimir Putin's design, and then you just take a look at what the result was, and the result's been awful. How many people lost their lives now in Ukraine? Where's the end in sight to that conflict? So I'm just saying we need to be retrospective of what history has shown us. Try not to repeat it, but unfortunately, I think we repeat it time and time again.
The other thing is that I feel like the stories are sold to us on the basis of we're fighting for somebody's freedom. We're going to Afghanistan. We're going to liberate the people. But then when you kind of look behind, read between the lines, it seems like there's heavy economic interests that are the real reason why we're there. Tell us about, I don't know if you feel like there's a propaganda machine at work here, or it seems like we go into wars with kind of well-crafted marketing messages are the pretext, but then there's real underlying reasons behind it.
So first of all, I think America is a great country. I don't think there's ever been a nation on earth that has protected freedom, that has produced the kind of prosperity and opportunity that we have in America. So, I'm an America first guy. Okay, I think America is a great country because we have good people. Not necessarily because our government has behaved the right way. Not that we haven't made mistakes in the past. Okay. But we're a great country because we have good people. And so we have good people that want the best for, first of all, everybody in our country, okay? We also want what's best for the rest of people in the world. And we've sent our sons and daughters to fight and die for other people's freedom. So I think that's a good impulse on our part. But I can't disagree with you in terms of, but what has really been the cause of these wars? What has been the real justification for them? Do we use the goodness of the American public and help initiate these things for potentially ulterior motives? I mean, that's the question I can't answer, but it's a question that should be asked. And probably us asking the question right now would probably get me in all kinds of trouble.
I think anyone that is on the quest of truth should be celebrated. And I think one of the beautiful things about this country is we do have the freedom of speech that I can question. I can question Biden. I can question Trump. And I'm not going to end up in a stadium in front of a firing squad. And that's a beautiful thing about this country. But it does seem
But you will be censored on YouTube. You'll be censored formally on Twitter. You will be canceled. You will be vilified. I mean, that's what's happened to me.
Tell people more about that. So have you kind of experienced the woke mob mentality?
Oh, repeatedly.
Yeah.
And by the way, I've been called a conspiracy theorist. When after January 6th, which I condemned the violence immediately and repeatedly and forcefully, okay? But I also acknowledge the fact, as I did with the summer riots of 2020, the vast majority of those people participating in those protests, over 570 turned into riots, the vast majority of people in both cases, assembled peacefully. That was their intent, okay? But I've been vilified for pointing out that there weren't thousands of armed insurrectionists. I've been accused of being conspiracy theorist because I entered into our hearing record, the Joint Senate Committee hearing. I was on the Homeland Security. I used to be chairman of it, but we lost the majority, so I no longer was chair. So I was just a member of that committee, but I entered into the record of our investigation to January 6th, the J. Michael Waller eyewitness account. Now, he's an experienced observer of this. So he teaches at the War College. So he came to January 6th just to observe, and he observed. And before he watched any news coverage, he wrote down a 14-page eyewitness account. And to summarize his eyewitness account, is he saw 4 distinct groups of what he would call provocateurs. I would call them agitators. And that really pushed this. Okay.
So to clarify for the people back home, are you referring to the term agent provocateur when it's really kind of an inside intelligence operative that's stirring things up to escalate things?
I don't think that's how he was using the term, but he called these 4 distinct groups of people in the crowd that pushed all this, that were really the spearhead of the violence. He identified those. So I just entered his eyewitness account into our hearing record, and the chairwoman, Amy Klobuchar of the committee, came out immediately and said, "Oh, Senator Johnson, he's spreading conspiracy theories." No, I entered the truth, an eyewitness account into the record. Now, it's maybe not the narrative you want. I mean, you wanted the narrative that there were thousands of armed insurrectionists. Did you see thousands of armed insurrectionists? Listen, again, there were areas of riots, okay? There was violence. We condemned it. But that's not what an armed insurrection would look like. You certainly wouldn't clean it up within 5 hours and get back to business later in the evening that night if you truly had an armed insurrection, and yet that was the narrative. It was a false narrative, but it was a narrative that was designed politically to paint half America as potential domestic terrorists, which is why you end up with the Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department under Biden suspecting Americans of being potentially domestic terrorists. Like, that's the greatest threat to this country. It's not.
So, as somebody that has voted independent all my life, I don't have a horse in the race for Democrats or Republicans. As an outsider, it does seem like right-wing ideas are the most censored. For instance, on YouTube, and I don't even know if we have to bleep this out. It seems that way
because that's what it is.
Right. Why do you think that is, and what is the agenda?
Because the left controls the vast majority of the media. And they control the vast majority of the media because the left controls our university system. Again, I'm old enough. I saw the left take over our university system in the 60s. The Vietnam War protests, college administration capitulated, and the radical left and moved in and pretty well control universities. So they control College of Education, of journalism, and law. They control all the universities, but those are the 3 key education centers now that they control. So we're cranking out a bunch of lawyers who then become activist judges, legislate from the bench. We're cranking out not journalists that are unbiased, they're advocates for the left. And we're cranking out teachers that are happy to indoctrinate our children with all this woke ideology that is further dividing this country. And again, if you want to ask me, so I'm going to ask my own question, what concerns you most about this country? In the past, I would probably say what Admiral Mike Mullen said in 2010, 2011, the greatest threat to this country is our debt and deficit. Right now, I would say the greatest threat to this country is the divisiveness. But it didn't just happen. It is being pushed. It's being pushed by groups that are trying to convince other Americans that they're hated, so that their group starts hating that group. It's just not true. When
you speak of woke ideology, what would you say is the front and center, the few couple talking points of like where wokeness is leading to the destruction of America?
Well, it's critical race theory. Trying to educate our young people that based on their color determines their outcome. Whether they have privilege or whether they have any chance in life. And it's just wrong. I mean, I think America, by and large, embraced Martin Luther King's vision of America to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I mean, I'm 68 years old. I've seen discrimination squeezed out of America. I have. It's not gone, but it's been dramatically reduced. Why don't we celebrate that success as opposed to exacerbate the divide? And that is what is happening. So critical race theory exacerbates the divide. Transgenderism. Listen, we're a compassionate nation, compassionate people. Anybody with true gender dysphoria, we have compassion for, okay? But I don't think we should be pushing transgenderism on impressionable children. And that's what's happening today. That further divides this country. And when parents see the schools trying to take control over raising their children, where now you have school systems in some states that, they won't even tell the parents if they're going to start administering gender-blocking drugs, which, by the way, have real harmful health effects. I mean, probably shorten your life. And I can't even believe, quite honestly, the doctors and nurses would mutilate a child. You can't get a tattoo if you're under 18 in most states without at least having parental consent, and yet we're doing this to children. This stuff to somebody like me is crazy, but it's being pushed on our society. It's dividing our society.
So one of the things you hit on earlier is that one of the fellow senators labeled you as a conspiracy theorist. So maybe this is a good segment to talk about some of the conspiracies that are out there, and I'll get your take on it. And we'll warm up with, I think it was just published yesterday that they've confirmed that there's alien aircraft that have been found, and that the potential, if we're ever knocking on the door that aliens are real, it feels like it got admitted within this last week. What is your take on that? And do you have any insider knowledge about UFOs you can tell the people?
I don't. I know Marco Rubio, who's the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee. He's kind of passed a law, or part of a law, inserted into it, the setting up of a board or process to try and expose this stuff. So I think this is why some of this is getting. But I have no knowledge just whatsoever. I've read the accounts that says we've got parts of aircraft or some kind of vehicle that is not of Earth origin.
What does that make you think? Because that is unbelievable, and to think that so much other crazy stuff is going on and that's not the #1 headline is astounding.
I don't know that it's believable, man, and that's a real problem. I mean, what is truth?
No one knows.
By the way, I held hearings as chairman of the European Subcommittee on Foreign Relations in 2015 when I took over the chairmanship. I held hearings on Russian disinformation. Now, fast forward in 2020, Democrats were accusing Senator Grassley and I of soliciting and disseminating Russian disinformation when we were investigating Hunter Biden. Does that sound familiar? And then the news media picked that up and vilified us for that and smeared us for that. But I'm trying to think of the point I was trying to make in terms of disinformation.
Well, I do have a follow-up on that. Is because I think Trump was heavily scrutinized, and I think it's fair that if someone is doing any dirt, I don't care what side of the aisle they are, if they're doing something dirty, they should be scrutinized. But it does seem like the Biden family has escaped. Like, for example, it seemed like the outcome of our election very well may have been determined by the lack of being willing to publish any of the Hunter Biden story. And who knows if it's true or not is not the point to me. It's whether we're allowed to talk about it. That's what really gets me.
Let me quit. The point I was trying to make in terms of disinformation, we found out in those hearings, Russia is spreading disinformation. They are, okay? But not for the purpose of trying to convince you that they're right. It's literally to get people to believe they can't believe anything. And I'd say we're kind of at that state here in America. It's like, what do you believe? I mean, are we going to really believe there's alien spacecraft, that our government has those parts and they've had them for decades? I mean, that's what people suspected, but anybody saying that, you are nuts, okay? So, now all of a sudden we're supposed to believe it? I don't know. But to answer the issue on the Bidens, I think it's obvious. Because I was a target of FBI interference in our investigation, quite honestly, in the Wisconsin U.S. Senate election. Let me just describe it, okay? So, and this is only part of the story here, okay? But let's say this thing starts in December 2019 when the FBI took possession of the Hunter Biden laptop. So they had it. On the way out the door, they look at Mr. McIsaac and say, it's our experience that people that don't talk about these things don't get in trouble, don't get hurt. So that was the start of their pre-sabotage in case the knowledge of that computer ever surfaced. Okay, later on, we've got whistleblowers saying that higher-ups of the FBI said, you're not going to look at that Hunter Biden laptop. Now we know in August, another whistleblower said that the FBI developed a scheme to downplay derogatory information on Hunter Biden. That same month, the FBI brought in 5 people to give both Senator Grassley and I separately an unsolicited briefing saying that we were targets of a Russian disinformation campaign. Now, I knew it was a setup at the time. There was no, I said, okay, do you have new intelligence? Why are you saying this? Because we've been being accused of disseminating Russian disinformation for months now. So what new news do you have here? Well, we can't tell you. Then I asked him, who told you to brief us about this? Interagency. Well, there are people there. Who? They wouldn't tell us. I've written 3 public letters to Christopher Wray. I've asked him in hearings. Who set up the briefing? They won't tell us.
Who is Christopher?
He's the director of the FBI. Okay.
I should probably know
that's
that.
Okay. Just been subpoenaed, probably be held in contempt because he's not complying with the subpoena
This
of the
is
House.
the piece that Marjorie Taylor Greene is working on, trying to.
Well, it's actually James Comer.
James Comer and Grass.
I subpoenaed Christopher Wray. He didn't give a squat. But here's the point. So they're pre-sabotaging the disclosure of the Hunter Biden laptop, okay, including to 2 U.S. senators who are investigating Hunter Biden, trying to get us to believe it's all Russian disinformation. Later on, in May of 2021, they leaked the fact that they gave a secure briefing to smear me. Like I'm ignoring the fact that Putin's trying to use me as a tool. Okay, it was all false.
Have you ever met Vladimir Putin, Senator Johnson?
I have not.
Has he ever tried to slip you a few 20s or anything like that?
He has not, and I'm no Vladimir Putin fan. He's a monster. He's a war criminal. Okay, he's committing atrocities. But again, what I'm pointing out is here you had the FBI. They knew the computer. By the way, once Senator Grassley and I issued our report on the Bidens, showed this vast web of foreign financial entanglements, hundreds of millions of dollars, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars of financial transactions. Okay, very suspicious. Okay, the Burisma things from Russia. Hunter Biden soliciting, sex trafficked women. Okay, the day after that, Mr. McIsaac offered us that computer. Now, again, we were being accused of disseminating Russian disinformation. That sounded like a pretty odd story. We didn't take it, could have been stolen property. So who did we go to? We went to the FBI. What do you know about this? Now, they should have told us what they knew about it. They didn't. They gave us the runaround for weeks until McIsaac finally turned that over to Giuliani's attorney. The New York Post got it. And then Anthony Blinken, who's our current Secretary of State, he went to Mike Mullen, who was the former Deputy Director of the CIA, and said, hey, can you help us out here? Can you get your buddies to write a letter saying that this is Russian disinformation? Of course, 51 intelligence officials, former intelligence officials, wrote a letter claiming the Hunter laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian information campaign, even though the FBI knew it was real and authentic. Again, so I mean, this is, and most of the public doesn't know this because the mainstream media isn't covering this outrageous interference in our election by the FBI, by the intelligence agencies, by the Department of Justice. But they interfered in our election in 2020 to a far greater extent than anything Russia ever could have done, going back to the total phony and corrupt investigation of the Russian collusion hoax, which was just made up. It was made up by Hillary Clinton and her campaign.
So, Senator Johnson, one thing that comes to mind is it just feels like this exhausting labyrinth of smoke and mirrors. It's so hard to know what's really going on. It's so hard to know who to trust, what to trust. And it seems like it's gotten us into a general stage of just apathy and that people are giving up. It's like we feel like all of what we're being told is bullshit. Why should we care anymore? Why should we be standing up? How do we break through this? And do you agree with my assessment of the situation?
Which is why I talked about my hearing on Russian disinformation. It's not designed to convince you that they're right. It's designed to make you believe that you can't believe anything, which creates chaos and destroys a country. Okay? So whoever's doing this, spreading disinformation, whoever is trying to divide us by claiming that that group hates you, so you hate them, okay? They're trying to destroy this country.
Well, and anyone that actually walks the streets knows it's a bunch of nonsense. Like, I know it's kind of like people want, oh, man and women are supposed to hate each other. Black and white are supposed to hate each other. Straight and gay are supposed to hate each other. I've been to some of the craziest places in this country, and there's no hatred there. And it's so like when you actually turn the media off and walk life for yourself, you realize people are pretty similar and they want to get along.
Yeah, so Tommy, I'm saying, who's pushing the narrative that one group hates the other group?
Could you tell me? I would love to know.
Well, it's not conservatives.
Now, here's the issue I have.
It's not.
The issue with that scares me is I feel like it's so easy to just be like, well, my camp, everything is right, and the other camp, everything's wrong.
And I wouldn't say that, okay?
Yeah.
But if you really take a look at, for example, the weaponization of the federal government, it starts with Lois Lerner under Obama going after Tea Party groups, weaponizing the IRS against Tea Party groups.
Didn't it start in the Bush administration under the Patriot Act as well?
Well, listen, I'm no fan of the Patriot Act anymore, now that I've seen how it's been abused with the FISA court. We need to repeal that, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, again, I was earlier criticizing the Iraq War. That was George W. Bush, okay? Afghanistan. We never, the best book I ever read on Afghanistan was written by a couple special ops guys who made the argument that we'd pretty well done what we need to do in Afghanistan using special ops forces, showing the Taliban, you better not let this happen again, and we should have ended it there, okay? And never put a boot on the ground with Tommy Franks. So no, I'm not letting anybody off the hook here, but the truth of the matter is in terms of what side of the political spectrum is trying to divide us, that's coming from the left. Now, it just is.
I agree on the media side, but I've also done my research on the right, and I've read a book called Dark Money that talks about the Koch brothers and all the money that they put from the smallest local election to the largest stage in the country. And I think it's fair to say that there's also dark money coming in on the right as well.
We weren't talking about political funding. We're talking about what the groups are pushing. Do the Kochs contribute money like George Soros? Yeah. But the Kochs, by and large, are trying to promote individual liberty and freedom, a free market system, limited government. That's really the vision of this country. They're not pushing hate groups, trying to convince you that that group hates you, so you hate them, which is what Black Lives Matter is doing, which is what Antifa is doing. Listen to my Democrat colleagues. Again, not only did a U.S. senator, I've never called another fellow senator a conspiracy theorist. I've never called another senator a racist. I was called a racist on the floor of the Senate by the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Robert Menendez.
What did you do to get that? Why did they call you a racist?
Well, it was on about January 6th where I just said something truthfully. I was never afraid on January 6th because I didn't see it. We were locked in the Senate chamber for about 5-10 minutes, open up the doors, go back to your office. I came back to my office. I started watching on TV. Were
you here in Washington, D.C. when that was going down?
I was right here when most of the rioting was occurring.
And it wasn't frightening at all to you?
We didn't see it. We're in the Senate chamber. They closed it up. I just assumed that some crazies got by security, and so they sealed the Senate chamber to protect us. Okay.
So you weren't like huddling in the corner with AOC, watching at the door?
No. Now a group of senators got put in a big hearing room here. They call it Hart 211 or whatever. Okay, that's where most senators went. I just went back to my office. Then we turned on the TV and go, oh my God. But again, we were safe here.
So did you never evacuate?
I said I never, Yeah, we evacuated the Senate chamber, okay? But, but again, I just made the statement. I was never frightened. Then you have a news meeting. How could you not be? So, yeah, I was just trying to explain.
You were a racist because you weren't frightened?
No, I was racist because I said this, and I'll repeat it, and I'll get in trouble for saying it. I said, one of the reasons I wasn't frightened is I knew who those protesters were. I mean, I'd gone to all the Trump rallies. I saw the people who were supporting Trump. They love this country. They love law enforcement. They wouldn't even think about breaking the law. And I said, now, again, we just come through the summer protests that turned, 570 of those turned into riots, 2,000 law enforcement officials injured, $1 to $2 billion of property damage, okay, a couple dozen people killed. Those, we're trying to bail those folks out, right? Okay, that was not a threat to our democracy, just mass protests turning into riots across the country. That was okay. Those were righteous protests. So we're coming off of those summer riots. Here's the November 20 election. Okay, now you got January 6th. And I just made the comment now, had the tables been turned, and if it had been the Summit rioters out there, BLM and Antifa, I might have been a little concerned. That's what I said. That statement was turned in like I'm a racist. No, I'm a realist going, I would have been more concerned about the people, if the people protesting would have been the people protesting in the summer of 2020, where those protests turned into 570 riots and injured 2,000 law enforcement. Ahead of time, I might have been a little more concerned about all of a sudden them sealing off the Senate chamber, but with a bunch of America-loving, freedom-loving, law enforcement-supporting people out there, which is what the vast majority of people are here on January 6th, initially I wasn't concerned.
So I am in agreement with you that there's plenty to call out on the left. The way the media is biased, woke stuff scares me and annoys me too. What's something that you feel like the right should be called out for?
You name something. Again, I already talked about, in hindsight, the war in Iraq was not a smart thing to do. I'm not pleased with a lot of my colleagues who are as big spenders as Democrats.
Yeah, I think because historically Republicans like to sell themselves as small government. We stick to the budget. But my golly, so I run a small business right here, Senator Johnson. If I spent like the federal government did, I would be homeless and on the streets right now. But year after year after year, we extend the debt ceiling. I think the average now is it's like almost 6 figures per American, almost $100,000 per American.
90-some thousand just in debt, yeah.
Why do we keep doing this under Republicans and Democrats? It seems to be a bipartisan.
It's the uniparty, and I'm highly critical of it, okay? Unfortunately, I mean, the public, until they demand fiscal sanity, they're going to get more of this because benefits are popular. And a lot of my colleagues are happy to vote more benefits on both sides of the aisle. And then they're happy to increase the debt ceiling to accommodate their reckless spending.
But how is no one ever held accountable? Like, why aren't people fired? Because an ordinary business, you'd be fired if you did that.
Because I would argue the media is on the side of the big spenders. Again, big spenders favor big government. And, the left is the party of the big government. And
didn't Trump spend a tremendous amount of money as well?
Pardon?
I believe both Trump, you just go in order.
Oh, Trump,
Bush, Biden, Obama have all been.
Well, yeah, Trump had COVID, okay? And I did reluctantly vote for the first COVID relief package, the CARES Act. But you have to recognize that thing, we need to do something massive. We had to do something fast so that markets wouldn't collapse.
It was kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Well, again, we had to do, you didn't want a contagion starting. Our financial system really runs on confidence. You lose confidence and you can have a real collapse real fast. We saw that with the contagion of the 2008, 2009 recession, okay? So we had to avert that. I thought the initial number they were talking about, $750 billion, was more than enough to do that, but the uniparty, Trump was obviously president at that point in time. Within a week, that was up to $2.2 trillion. That was the last COVID relief package I voted for because we misspent hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of that money. So we went from spending $4.4 trillion in 2019 to 6.5 to 6.8 to 6.3, and now we've just locked in. Rather than going back to a reasonable baseline, right? Okay, pandemic's over. So why don't we go back to the baseline of about $4.4 trillion in 2019, grow it by population inflation, that would put spending last year about $5.1 trillion. But instead, we're up to 6.3, and we just locked that in, which is why I didn't vote for the increase in the debt ceiling. And, my comments said, listen, Democrats have no problem. They don't. Mortgaging our kids' future. And unfortunately, Republicans, there are some that go along with that, but Republicans have not found a way to stop them.
So there's a common feeling in my generation, and excuse my French, but it just seems like the younger generation in America is absolutely fucked. What do you think about that?
You ought to be pretty PO'd. No, listen, when I ran in 2010, I was in parades as a candidate. 4th of July, okay, saying, we're mortgaging our kids' future. It's immoral. It's got to stop. We got to fight for freedom. That was my rally cry. That's why I ran in 2010. No, I can't believe that young people aren't completely ticked. But the reason they're not ticked off is because the media is not covering it. The media is covering up for it. They don't talk about the debt situation. You're one of the rare Americans that realizes that your individual debt burden at $32 trillion is close to $100,000 right now. That is, and it's going to,
It's like a game show that never ends, but it's not really a fun result.
But here's the problem: is we haven't seen the calamity of it yet. We haven't hit a debt crisis because we're still the world's reserve currency. So we can still print dollars. Now, the printing of the dollars results in 40-year high inflation. So a dollar that you held at the start of the Biden administration is now worth less than 87 cents, like 86 cents. That's just in 2 years plus. We've gone from a dollar being worth $1 back then, which again has been degraded from what a dollar was in the 90s.
Sure.
And, but just in 2 years, it's gone from $1 to 86 cents. That's outrageous. So that is what all this deficit spending is doing. It's reducing the value of your dollar. So if you're a saver, you're really getting hosed. If you're a borrower like the federal government, that's how the federal government is going to try and get out from under this debt crisis. But they're going to try and inflate their way out. But inflation damages a lot of people.
So one of the things you mentioned was things that are being overlooked, covered up. And to me, the story of our era is the Jeffrey Epstein story. I guess the first question, and this might get us censored on YouTube, but do you think Jeffrey Epstein killed himself?
It seems pretty amazing he would have been able to. And again, it's just kind of, I talked about the JFK and the unspeakable. And if you read that book, you'll just see all the witnesses that died, were murdered, all the evidence that should have obviously been collected that wasn't, that was overlooked. So I think the same thing here is with Jeffrey. Oh, gee, those prison cameras just weren't functioning, and the guards just happened to go to sleep, and
his neck got broken.
And who are the guests on Epstein Island? We still don't know. Why not?
So it feels like it's actually been safely swept under the rug. I had a tiny bit of hope that during the Ghislaine Maxwell trial that things would be uncovered, but to me it seems like it's been firmly put to bed and out of the American consciousness, and that to me is outrageous. What is your take on that?
Well, that's how corrupt individuals get away with their corruption. They drag the investigatory process out long enough. Some new crisis appears, and that's just old news.
Okay.
Happens time and time and time again.
Another theme that we've been exploring heavily today is dark money in politics. That people can get undisclosed amount of donations, or and I might be phrasing it incorrectly, but that all of a sudden you have millions and millions and millions of dollars pouring in, and you can't really trace it. It seems fishy, it seems wrong, and it seems like something that should never have been instituted in the first place.
So first of all, what we should do for campaign finance is not have any limits on what you can donate to a candidate, but it needs to be disclosed immediately or within 24 hours or whatever. Okay, so complete disclosure. So if some candidate wants to take $1 million from somebody, well, they're going to get painted as a puppet for that individual. Okay, and then the electorate can decide as long as they have the information. You do need to be very careful about forcing disclosure of people contributing to political groups. The Supreme Court case that by and large allowed that, I know people say Citizens United, but it really was Alabama versus the NAACP, which back in the 50s, Alabama was trying to force the NAACP to disclose its donor list. Why do you think that was? And the Supreme Court ruled 9 to nothing that donors to a political group ought to have their identities remain anonymous so they can't be targeted. So again, so I understand what you're talking about, dark money. Somebody who's run for office and had to run against $100 million plus, mostly of dark money spent against me, lying about me. It'd be nice to clean it up. But I also do believe in free speech, and I also believe in people's ability to be able to donate to a political cause of theirs without being persecuted or targeted for it. And of course, if you disclose it, then you're going to be targeted.
Tell me more about lobbyists, because I think it's something that Americans just assume is just outright bad. But I also think that there's the shoe on the other foot, that you do have a campaign to run. You have to be competitive. But I believe it was the NRA list. You're number 7 or 11 on money from the NRA.
First of all, I have no idea. I really have no idea, okay? Doesn't impact me one way or the other. And I don't think it really impacts that many people. I mean, most donations are limited to, what, $5,000 or $10,000? And you're running campaigns that cost tens, if not $100 million plus. So first of all, from my standpoint, there is certainly a corrupting influence. I mean, that's what we're talking about, the corporatism. We're talking about, big unions capturing these agencies. But it's more a problem because we've allowed government to become so powerful and have such great influence over our lives that then any entity that can capture those agencies can exert far greater influence than just them as operating as businesses or as unions. Okay, so it's big government that allows that. But lobbyists, I always tell lobbyists, don't feel guilty about what you're doing. It's a First Amendment right to be able to petition your government. And by and large, I think lobbyists, as I see them operate here, they're educators. They're trying to inform members of Congress and their staff about what government's doing to their business, their organization, whatever, in terms of making it difficult for them to accomplish their mission. So I don't think it's the money from lobbyists that is the big problem. I'm not saying it can't be part of the problem, but again, the way to solve it all would be full disclosure, unlimited donations to candidates, but just with full disclosure.
So I guess, should it raise alarm if you see someone, if Pfizer donates $1 million to a senator down the hallway's campaign? I don't know. If NRA donates $1 million to your campaign, I don't know
how Pfizer could do that. I mean, Pfizer would be limited to whatever the limits are, $5,000, $10,000 a year to a candidate.
But isn't that the argument with dark money, that Pfizer can give that in chunks to different operatives that then funnel it back into the...
But I'm telling you, as a U.S. Senator, I don't know. I don't look at this stuff. I know outside groups look at who donated my campaign. I don't. Doesn't impact my decisions or my votes on anything.
Right. I don't know. Do you think every senator can say that, though?
I don't know. I'm just saying, from my standpoint, I literally pay no attention to who donates. Obviously, I've got to raise money. I know it at the time, but it just doesn't impact. Certainly doesn't impact my votes. Most people who donate to me because they realize I'm by and large on the same side of issues with them. So the NRA would donate to me because, I support the Second Amendment. And by the way, I'm glad to see that Bobby Kennedy does too.
Let's talk about another issue that to me has been kind of infuriating to watch, which is, I know a few senators are probably on this list, but the first one that comes to mind is Nancy Pelosi, in terms of the most impeccable stock trader timing ever in history. I mean, she's outperformed hedge funds 3 years in a row. And then you see guys that they're on this commission where they hear COVID's about to start, and then they trade off everything right before we announce the shutdown. It seems so obvious. What do you think about the allegations of insider trading in our government?
Well, first of all, it's illegal. Can't do it.
It seems like it's happening, though.
Well, so that needs to be enforced. I mean, I can only speak for myself. What I did when I became a U.S. Senator is I sold all my marketable securities, and I've held them in cash. So I've taken a real beating on what I used to hold in marketable securities, just so that nobody could ever accuse me of that kind of conflict of interest. So that's what I've done for a personal basis. So I have, what you don't want to do is dissuade people that actually have experience in the private sector. And I'd like to see successful experience in the private sector from serving in government. I mean, we have too little of that. One of the problems we have in federal government is there's so very few bureaucrats serving in the executive branch, or members of Congress or staff of members of Congress that have any experience in, which means very little knowledge of, and maybe even worse, very little sympathy for the private sector. I mean, running business is hard, right? There's
Very
nothing easy about it. And high levels of taxation, high levels of regulation don't make it any easier. Yeah, it's not to say we shouldn't have taxes or we shouldn't have some regulation, but government just exists to increase taxes and to increase regulations, okay, as opposed to sitting back and go, let's hold off here, little guys. You know, we don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and that's called the private sector.
Another thing that I've been pondering is what should disqualify a senator from serving? There's two senators that I come to mind. I won't mention my name because I don't want to put you in a position where you have to comment directly on that. There's one that she is, well, this will give it away, but about 89 years old, and it seems like they're wheeling her in there. I don't even know if she can make it to her meetings. I don't know if there should be an age limit because I don't think age determines your body and competency. But if you're medically unfit to serve, I feel like the best thing to do is to stand up and resign. Any comment on that one?
Well, first of all, the limit on who should serve as senator should be the voters.
So do you think there should be an age? Because we have an age limit on the bottom end of the bracket, how young you can be. Do you think there should be an age limit on the top end of the bracket?
Listen, I would, and I've said in the past, I would support some measure of term limits, but got to be a reasonably long term, or else
you can't get anything done and lobbyists run everything.
Well, and the electorate has no say in the process, because the American people only have a connection to government through their elected representatives. If you're turning them over all the time, the bureaucrats and staff completely rule. And trust me, staff of congressional members are happy to run the show. To provide the member information only on a need-to-know basis. So they're happy to manage their members. So you really do need members that are here while they kind of understand, okay, this is how this process doesn't work, and again, represent the people that put them into office. So again, if you want draconian term limits, all you're doing is you're just cutting off literally your influence as a voter over the process here, and you're turning all the power over to the executive branch. And that's part of our problem we have too. Previous Congress have willingly given their constitutional authority to the president, and the presidents have eagerly, gobbled it up. So we don't have three co-equal branches of government anymore.
The other senator that comes to mind is a gentleman who was in the private sector in healthcare. His company did Medicare fraud, and he had to pay a $1.7 billion fine. At the time, the biggest healthcare fraud ever done in American history, and he is now an American senator. Do you feel like committing? I know people that have robbed banks that have served 10 years for like $100,000 or $200,000. This guy got a $1.7 billion fine, which means his fraud was probably even more than that, and he's serving as a senator. Does that seem ridiculous to you?
The voters, I would assume, knew all that when they voted him into office. So again, you do hold the voters accountable, and people are going to elect the people they want to represent them.
I guess it's also
so again. I actually hold the voters supreme, just like the 10th Amendment. I mean, the power respectively to the people. Okay.
100%.
So again, it's got to be the responsibility of the people.
I guess that's the idea that someone can do a white collar crime, not do a day of jail, and put billions of dollars, in the wrong hands, but a guy can do a more criminal thing where he steals from a bank and he does 10, 20 years. That just seems unbalanced to me. Well,
listen, I think you can take a look, and I've been railing that we don't have an equal system of justice. We have, I would say, multiple levels of justice, and we've seen it. We've take a look at the Bidens. I mean, they're not being held to the same standard as, for example, Republican. Take a look at what's happened to the January 6ers. Again, I want to see the people that committed violence, prosecuted, but at the same time, what about the people who committed violence in the summer riots?
Sure.
They're getting all these plea agreements, and we've just got almost a holy jihad from the Justice Department against anybody even showed up in Washington, D.C., SWAT arrests in there. So again, we don't have, unfortunately, equal application of justice. I think that's a real problem in America.
Senator Johnson, you're a busy man, and we have quite the schedule today. I'm going to cut this short, but what I want to leave it on is there anything that you think the American people should know? Anything that you want to say as your final remarks?
There's all kinds of things American people need to know. The political process doesn't convey information properly. I don't think the news media does either. And we were talking earlier. I asked my colleagues, anybody know how much we spent last year? I mean, if senators don't know, if the Washington news media doesn't know, I mean, the general population doesn't know, and they ought to know that. They ought to know that in 2002 we spent the first time over $2 trillion, and 17 years later, it's 4.4. Now we're laying in a baseline of 6.3 when we're $32 trillion in debt. They ought to know those things, okay? So I'm not sure how you correct that process, but all I can say is, my dedication is to provide that kind of information. Provide the truth. Our office, Senate office, has a 3-word mission statement: to help people. And of course, my staff has really taken up that goal, and they help people with passports or Social Security benefits, Medicare, veterans benefits, that type of thing. My bullet point underneath that is to help people understand. And I made 2 promises when I first ran. I'll never vote with my reelection mind, which means I'll not conduct myself with my reelection mind. I'll always tell you the truth. And if we had more public servants, quite honestly, if we had more people in the news media just trying to convey the truth. Now, again, what is truth? And people have different perspectives of what the truth is. Mm-hmm. But that's what we need to pursue. Freedom is the essential ingredient of America. It's what allows you to dream, aspire, build, and create, okay? That's how we've created this nation. But the higher value is truth. And truth is has been the victim over the last few decades. And that's a real problem.
The 2 things that I think when I think of America that I'm most proud of, the 2 words I would use to describe it is freedom and truth. And I think those are very high virtues that we can chase, and that you should always be on the quest for living a truthful life and a free life. And so I very much appreciate you sitting down, doing this interview. Of all 100 senators I emailed, we got a couple maybes, but you were the only one that was able to sit down and do this.
But let me throw one more word in, particularly for young people, but for everybody. Be kind.
So be kind, tell the truth, always fight for freedom, and we'll see you next episode, guys. Thank you.